For 3 years, my family called my physical therapy work playing doctor, and said I was wasting my military training on broken soldiers who'd never be whole again. They mocked every success story, dismissed every breakthrough, and made it clear I was the family disappointment. Then last Tuesday, something happened that left them speechless. 12 Marines I had helped heal showed up at my door in full dress uniform, forming an honor guard that would change everything my family thought they knew about my worthless career. This is the story of how the people my own family called lost causes became my greatest validation. My name is Lieutenant Sarah Rodriguez, and I've spent the last 5 years learning that sometimes the people who should support you the most are the ones who understand you the least. But before I tell you about the moment that changed everything, let me take you back to where this all started. A family dinner that would haunt me for years. The Martinez family has military in their blood. Not just service, excellence. My grandfather, General Antonio Martinez, was a decorated World War II veteran who helped establish the modern military medical corps. His portrait hangs in the Pentagon. My grandmother, Maria Martinez, was one of the first Latina military nurses to achieve the rank of colonel during the Korean War. Growing up in San Antonio, Texas, meant growing up surrounded by this legacy. Every wall in our house told a story of service, sacrifice, and achievement. The den was practically a museum. Purple hearts, bronze stars, commendation letters from presidents, newspaper clippings from my family's various military accomplishments. My father, Colonel Roberto Martinez, retired Marines, served for 30 years. 3 tours in Vietnam, 2 in the Gulf War, 1 in Afghanistan, before taking a desk job at the Pentagon. His specialty was military strategy and logistics. When he spoke, even retired generals listened. His reputation preceded him into every room he entered. My mother, Dr. Elena Martinez, took a different path to excellence. After completing her military medical training, she became head of trauma surgery at San Antonio General Hospital. She's saved more lives than I can count, operates on cases other surgeons won't touch, and has been featured in 3 medical journals for her innovative surgical techniques. When she walks through the hospital corridors, residents practically bow. My older brother Carlos followed Dad's footsteps directly into combat. Navy SEAL, 3 deployments to Afghanistan, 2 to Iraq, currently stationed at Naval Special Warfare Command in Virginia Beach. He's the kind of operator they make movies about. His call sign is Ghost, because of how silently he can move through enemy territory. The stories I'm allowed to hear about his missions would make your jaw drop. My sister Isabel chose the sky. Air Force pilot, currently stationed in Germany flying F-16s. She's logged over 2,000 flight hours, completed 2 combat deployments, and is being considered for the Thunderbirds demonstration team. When she was 12, she built a model airplane that actually flew. By 16, she had her civilian pilot's license. By 21, she was flying million-dollar fighter jets. And then there was me. Don't get me wrong, I wasn't some rebellious kid who hated the military. I loved everything about service, about helping people, about being part of something bigger than myself. When I was 8 years old, I used to set up a pretend medical station in our backyard and treat wounded action figures. My parents thought it was cute. They assumed I'd grow up to be a surgeon like Mom, maybe specialize in military trauma surgery. I excelled in school, particularly in science and math. Graduated valedictorian from Robert E. Lee High School, scored in the 99th percentile on my SATs, received a full ROTC scholarship to the University of Texas. My parents couldn't have been prouder. At my high school graduation, Dad stood up and applauded when they announced I was headed for pre-med. College was where things started to shift. During my pre-med coursework, I volunteered at the VA hospital in Austin. That's where I first encountered military physical therapy. I watched PTs working with veterans who had traumatic brain injuries, spinal cord damage, amputations from IED explosions. But what struck me wasn't the injuries. It was the transformation I witnessed. I'll never forget this one veteran, Staff Sergeant David Chen. He'd lost both legs below the knee in Fallujah. When I first saw him, he was angry, depressed, convinced his life was over. The doctors had stabilized him medically, but his spirit was broken. Then I watched his physical therapist, Captain Jennifer Walsh, work with him for 3 months. She didn't just teach him to walk again, she helped him discover that he could run, jump, even compete in athletics. By the time I finished my volunteer hours, David was training for the Paralympics. But more than that, he'd found his purpose again. He was mentoring other amputee veterans, showing them what was possible. That's when I realized something that would shape my entire career. Medical intervention can save a life, but rehabilitation can give someone their life back. Surgery fixes the immediate problem. Physical therapy rebuilds the person. So when it came time to choose my medical specialty after completing basic medical training, I applied for advanced physical therapy certification with a focus on combat-related rehabilitation. I wanted to specialize in the cases other people considered too complex, too challenging, too unlikely to succeed. I announced this decision at our traditional Sunday family dinner in March, 3 years ago. The whole family was there: parents, Carlos on leave, Isabel via video call from Germany, plus my Uncle Miguel, who's a retired Army doctor, my Aunt Rosa, who served as a military nurse, and various cousins who were active duty or veterans. Physical therapy? My father asked, setting down his fork. The entire table went quiet. Sarah, you have the highest MCAT scores in your class. You could specialize in anything. Neurosurgery, cardiothoracic surgery, emergency medicine. Why would you choose physical therapy? The way he said physical therapy made it sound like I'd announced I was becoming a professional dog walker. My mother jumped in, her surgeon's precision evident even in conversation. Meja, physical therapy is fine for some people, but you have the skills to save lives in the operating room. PT it's maintenance work. You'd be wasting your potential. Uncle Miguel nodded sagely. Elena's right, Sarah. I spent 30 years in military medicine. The real impact, the real difference, happens in trauma surgery. Physical therapy is what happens after the important work is done. But it was my cousin Antonio's comment that really stung. He was a Marine Staff Sergeant, had served 2 tours in Iraq. I've been through PT myself after I injured my back, he said, shrugging. It's basically expensive stretching. And honestly, most of these PTSD guys coming back, they're never going to be the same anyway. You'd be trying to fix people who can't really be fixed. The table erupted in murmurs of agreement. Carlos, my Navy SEAL brother, added, Antonio's got a point. I've seen a lot of good operators get messed up downrange. The docs can patch them up, but once their head's scrambled or they lose a limb, that's pretty much it for their military career. PT might help them walk again, but they're never going to be warriors again. I tried to explain what I'd witnessed at the VA hospital, tried to describe the transformations I'd seen, but every example I gave was met with skepticism or outright dismissal. That's one success story out of how many failures, my father asked. Sarah, you're being naive, my mother added. Medical miracles are rare. Most rehabilitation cases plateau quickly. You'd spend your career making minimal improvements on cases with limited potential. The conversation ended with my father's final verdict. You're going to waste 4 years of advanced medical training to become a glorified gym instructor for broken soldiers. I'm disappointed, Sarah. We raised you to aim higher than this. I left early that night. Drove back to my base housing in silence, replaying every dismissive comment, every skeptical look, every implication that I was settling for something beneath my abilities. But the next morning, something happened that would reinforce my decision in ways my family couldn't understand. I was doing my clinical rotations at the Warrior Recovery Center at Fort Carson, Colorado. It's a specialized facility that handles the most complex combat-related injuries, traumatic brain injuries, multiple amputations, severe PTSD cases, spinal cord damage. The cases that other hospitals transfer out because they're too challenging or unlikely to show significant improvement. My supervisor, Major Patricia Williams, had been running the center for 8 years. She'd seen thousands of cases, developed innovative rehabilitation protocols, and had a reputation throughout the military medical community for achieving results with impossible patients. Rodriguez, she said on my first day, forget everything you think you know about limitations. Our job here isn't to manage disabilities. It's to help people rediscover their capabilities. The center was unlike any medical facility I'd ever seen. Instead of sterile hospital rooms, it looked more like a high-tech athletic training facility. There were pools for aquatic therapy, rock climbing walls for building strength and confidence, virtual reality systems for treating PTSD, prosthetic training areas that looked like obstacle courses, and even a driving simulator for veterans learning to operate vehicles with new disabilities. But what really impressed me was the staff philosophy. During my first team meeting, Major Williams explained their approach. We don't treat injuries here. We don't treat disabilities. We treat human beings who happen to have encountered setbacks. Our job is to help them write the next chapter of their story. My first case was Lance Corporal Maria Santos, a Marine who'd sustained a severe traumatic brain injury from an IED explosion in Afghanistan. She'd been in a coma for 6 weeks, and when she woke up, she couldn't speak, couldn't walk, couldn't remember basic information like her own name. Traditional medical approaches had stabilized her condition, but multiple specialists had told her family that significant recovery was unlikely. She'll probably need full-time care for the rest of her life, one neurologist had said. Brain injuries like this don't typically show dramatic improvement after the first few months. But Major Williams assigned her to my caseload anyway. Rodriguez, I want you to work with Maria for 3 months. Ignore what the other specialists said. Focus on what she can do today and build from there. Over the next 12 weeks, I watched Maria transform. Not because of some miraculous medical breakthrough, but because someone finally treated her like a person instead of a diagnosis. We started with basic communication, not through traditional speech therapy, but through music therapy, since she'd been a drummer before her deployment. Within a month, she was tapping out rhythms. Within 2 months, she was humming melodies. By month 3, she was speaking in full sentences. But the breakthrough came when she asked me, Lieutenant Rodriguez, when can I start drumming again? She wasn't asking when she'd be normal again. She was asking when she could return to something that gave her joy. By the end of our program, Maria had not only regained her speech and mobility, but she'd started a drum therapy program for other TBI patients. She'd found a new purpose that built on her injury experience, rather than trying to pretend it never happened. When I called my parents to tell them about Maria's progress, their reaction was predictably dismissive. That's nice, Mija, my mother said. But one success doesn't validate your career choice. How many patients like her don't recover? My father was more direct. Sarah, you're describing what any competent physical therapist would achieve. This isn't groundbreaking medicine. This is basic rehabilitation that someone else could have handled just as well. But they were wrong. And over the next 2 years, I would prove it in ways that would eventually bring 12 Marines to my doorstep. My second major case was Staff Sergeant Marcus Thompson, a Marine who had lost his right leg below the knee in Afghanistan. When he arrived at our center, he was angry, depressed, and convinced his military career was over. He'd been through 3 different PT programs at other facilities, and each one had focused on helping him, quote, to civilian life. Ma'am, I'm not interested in adapting to anything, he told me during our first session. I'm a Marine. I've been a Marine for 8 years. I don't know how to be anything else, and I don't want to learn. Instead of trying to convince him to accept his limitations, I asked him a different question. What would it take for you to feel like a Marine again? Marcus's answer was simple. He wanted to return to active duty. Everyone told him it was impossible. Amputee veterans don't return to combat roles. They transition to support positions or medical retirement. But Marcus and I spent 6 months proving everyone wrong. We didn't just focus on walking with his prosthetic. We focused on running, jumping, climbing, carrying heavy equipment, all the physical demands of active Marine duty. More importantly, we brought in other active duty Marines to train with him. Instead of treating him like a patient, we treated him like a Marine who happened to have different equipment. His prosthetic wasn't a disability, it was gear. 8 months later, Marcus received deployment orders. He was returning to Afghanistan, not in a support role, but as an active infantry Marine. He was the first amputee Marine in his unit's history to return to combat duty. When I told my family about Marcus's success, their reaction was evolving from dismissive to confused. That's Actually impressive, Carlos admitted. I've never heard of an amputee returning to infantry duty. Quote. But my father remained skeptical. One exceptional case doesn't change the reality that most military amputees end up in desk jobs or civilian life. You're focusing on the outliers. What my father didn't understand was that Marcus wasn't an outlier. He was proof of concept. Word about his success spread through the Marine network faster than I could have imagined. Within 6 months, we started receiving transfer requests from amputee Marines all over the country who had been told they'd never serve actively again. Corporal Jennifer Liu had lost both legs in an IED explosion. After working with our program for a year, she returned to active duty as a cybersecurity specialist. But more than that, she became the first double amputee to complete the Marine Corps Marathon. Staff Sergeant Robert Kim had sustained severe burns over 60% of his body. Traditional rehabilitation focused on basic mobility and pain management. Our program helped him return not just to active duty, but to his specialized role as an explosive ordnance disposal technician. Sergeant First Class Amanda Torres had a traumatic brain injury that left her with severe memory issues and difficulty processing information. Instead of medical retirement, she developed new cognitive strategies that allowed her to return to her role as a logistics coordinator, and she became more efficient than before her injury. Each success built on the previous one. These weren't isolated miracles. They were the result of a different philosophy about human potential. We weren't trying to restore people to their previous condition. We were helping them discover capabilities they didn't know they had. But my family's skepticism reached its peak 6 months ago, during my nephew Miguel's baptism. The entire extended family was there, 3 generations of military service, all in their dress uniforms or professional attire. I was wearing my army dress blues, proud of the work I'd been doing, excited to share some of our recent successes. The Warrior Recovery Center had just been featured in a military medical journal for our innovative approaches to complex rehabilitation cases. Uncle Miguel, who's a retired Army doctor with 30 years of experience, asked what I was up to these days. Before I could answer with my prepared update about our program's recognition, my father jumped in. "Oh, Sarah's still doing her little therapy sessions," he said with a dismissive wave. "Playing with stress balls and teaching people to walk again. We keep hoping she'll grow out of it and do some real medicine." The entire table laughed. Not just polite chuckles, but genuine laughter, as if my career was an amusing phase one was going through. My cousin Antonio added the comment that really stung. "I heard those PTSD guys never really get better anyway. Isn't it kind of pointless? Like putting a bandage on a bullet wound?" More laughter. Even my Aunt Rosa, who I'd always respected, smiled and nodded in agreement. But it was my brother Carlos who delivered the knockout punch. "Come on, Sarah," he said. "You're smart enough to know that most of these guys are broken for good. You might help them feel a little better, but they're never going to be warriors again. You're basically a very expensive counselor." I excused myself early that night. Made some excuse about an early shift the next day. Drove the 8 hours back to Colorado in complete silence, replaying every dismissive comment, every skeptical look, every implication that my work was somehow lesser than real medicine. For the first time since choosing this specialty, I wondered if they were right. Maybe I was wasting my potential. Maybe I should transfer to emergency medicine or trauma surgery, something that would finally make them proud, something they could respect. But when I walked into the Warrior Recovery Center the following Monday morning, everything changed. Because waiting for me in the lobby was Staff Sergeant Marcus Thompson, the same Marine who had lost his leg, the same one my family would have called a lost cause. Marcus wasn't in his wheelchair. He wasn't even using his everyday prosthetic. He was standing tall in his full dress blues, ribbons perfectly aligned, shoes polished to a mirror shine. He looked like every Marine recruitment poster come to life. "Ma'am," he said, rendering a perfect salute. "Staff Sergeant Thompson reporting. I wanted to thank you before I ship out to my new assignment." I returned his salute, confused. New assignment? His smile could have powered the entire building. "Yes, ma'am. I'm being deployed again. Active duty infantry assignment, Afghanistan. They said it was impossible, but you never treated me like I was broken." He handed me a copy of his deployment orders. Not desk duty, not support role. full combat infantry position. He was returning to the exact same job he'd had before his injury, with the exact same unit at the exact same rank. "Ma'am," Marcus continued, "I need you to understand something. You didn't just help me walk again, you helped me remember who I am. And because of that, I'm going back to do the job I love, with the people I love, in service of the country I love." As Marcus was speaking, I noticed other patients gathering in the lobby. Maria Santos, the TBI patient who'd started the drum therapy program. Jennifer Liu, the double amputee who'd returned to cybersecurity. Robert Kim, the burn victim who'd gone back to explosive ordnance disposal. They weren't there for therapy appointments. They were there to witness Marcus's moment, to celebrate one of their own returning to full active duty. "Lieutenant Rodriguez," Maria said, "Marcus asked us to be here because he wanted you to see something. Look around this room, really look." I looked at the assembled group, a dozen veterans, various injuries, different branches of service. But they weren't patients anymore. They were success stories. They were proof that the conventional wisdom about recovery limitations was wrong. "Ma'am," Jennifer Liu added, "we've all been talking. What you're doing here isn't just physical therapy. You're giving people their lives back. You're proving that our injuries don't define our limitations. Our belief in ourselves does." That's when I realized my family was wrong about everything. They saw my work as fixing broken soldiers. But I wasn't fixing anyone. I was helping people reclaim their strength, their purpose, their identity. I was proving that the human spirit is more resilient than any injury. And Marcus was just the beginning. Because what happened over the next 6 months would prove that the people my family called lost causes were about to become my greatest advocates. Word about Marcus's success spread through the Marine Corps network like wildfire. Within weeks, we started receiving calls from Marines all over the country, from commanders who had been told their injured personnel would never return to duty, from families who had been told to prepare for permanent disability. Our patient load tripled. The Warrior Recovery Center expanded to accommodate the demand. I was promoted to lead the new Marine-specific rehabilitation program. And with each success story, each return to active duty, each life reclaimed, I felt more confident that I had chosen exactly the right path. But I had no idea that these Marines I was helping heal were talking among themselves. I didn't know they were staying in touch after their programs ended, creating a network of warriors who shared one thing in common. They'd been written off by the system until someone believed in their potential. And I definitely didn't know that they were planning something that would change how my family saw me forever. Because last Tuesday, 12 of them showed up at my door, in full dress uniform, with a message that would leave my entire family speechless and prove once and for all that the work they called pointless had created something extraordinary. But first, let me tell you about the call that started it all. The call that would bring my two worlds crashing together in the most unexpected way. The call came on a Tuesday morning at 6:47 a.m. I remember the exact time because I was in the middle of my morning run around the base, and my phone never rings that early, unless it's an emergency. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the area code was from San Antonio, home. "Lieutenant Rodriguez?" The voice was unfamiliar, older, with the kind of authority that comes from decades of military service. "Yes, this is Lieutenant Rodriguez. Who is this?" "Ma'am, this is Command Sergeant Major William Hayes, 1st Marine Division. I'm calling about one of your former patients, Staff Sergeant Marcus Thompson." My heart stopped. Marcus had been deployed for 4 months. In my line of work, early morning calls about deployed patients usually meant one thing. "Is Marcus okay? Has something happened?" "Ma'am, Staff Sergeant Thompson is fine. More than fine, actually. That's why I'm calling." I stopped running and leaned against a nearby bench, trying to catch my breath and process what he was saying. "I don't understand, Sergeant Major." "Lieutenant Rodriguez, in my 32 years of service, I've never seen anything like what Staff Sergeant Thompson accomplished last week. I thought you should know, since you're the one who got him back on his feet." Command Sergeant Major Hayes went on to explain that Marcus's unit had been conducting a routine patrol in Kandahar province when they came under heavy fire from a Taliban ambush. During the firefight, their squad leader had been severely wounded and pinned down under enemy fire. The standard protocol would have been to call for backup and wait for extraction. Instead, Marcus had volunteered to crawl through 200 meters of open terrain under active fire to reach his wounded squad leader. Using his prosthetic leg as leverage in ways that would have been impossible with a biological limb, he was able to navigate through terrain that other Marines couldn't traverse. He reached the wounded soldier, provided first aid under fire, and then carried him to safety. "Ma'am," Command Sergeant Major Hayes continued, "Staff Sergeant Thompson saved that Marine's life. But more than that, he showed leadership and courage that reminded every Marine in that unit why we do what we do. His prosthetic wasn't a limitation, it was an advantage." I was speechless. This was the same Marine my family had dismissed as a lost cause, the same one they said would never be a warrior again. Quote, "There's more, Lieutenant Rodriguez. Word about what Marcus did has spread throughout the Marine Corps. We've been getting inquiries from commanders all over the world asking about your rehabilitation program. They want to know how we can help more injured Marines return to active duty instead of just writing them off." Command Sergeant Major Hayes explained that the Marine Corps was considering establishing a new rehabilitation protocol based on the work we'd been doing at the Warrior Recovery Center. They wanted to expand our approach to other military medical facilities worldwide. "But that's not the main reason I'm calling," he said. "Staff Sergeant Thompson asked me to reach out to you personally. He said you needed to know that the work you're doing matters more than you realize. He said some people in your life don't understand the impact you're having, and he wanted to make sure you knew that every Marine in his unit considers you a hero." After I hung up, I sat on that bench for 20 minutes, staring at my phone. Marcus was not only surviving his deployment, he was excelling. He was proving every single one of my family's assumptions wrong. But the call also highlighted something that had been gnawing at me for months. The disconnect between what I knew my work was accomplishing and how my family perceived it was becoming unbearable. They lived in a world where success was measured by rank, prestige, and recognition. I lived in a world where success was measured by whether someone could walk again, serve again, find purpose again. That afternoon, I made a decision that would change everything. I called my mother. "Mija, what a nice surprise," she said when she picked up. "How's your little therapy work going?" Even in her greeting, I could hear the dismissive tone that had become so familiar. But this time, instead of getting defensive, I decided to try a different approach. "Mom, I want to invite the family to visit me here at Fort Carson. I'd like to show you what we actually do at the Warrior Recovery Center." There was a pause. "Oh, sweetheart, that's very nice, but we're all so busy. Your father has his consulting work, Carlos is training for a new deployment, Isabel is in Germany. Mom, please. I think if you could see what we accomplish here, you might understand why this work is so important to me." Another pause, longer this time. "Sarah, you don't need to prove anything to us. We just want you to be happy and fulfilled in your career." "But you don't think I am fulfilled. You think I'm wasting my potential." "We think you're capable of more, yes. But if physical therapy makes you happy." The conversation continued in circles for another 10 minutes. My mother agreed to mention the invitation to the rest of the family, but I could tell she didn't expect anyone to take me up on it. To them, visiting my workplace would be like visiting a daycare center. Pleasant, but not particularly impressive or worthwhile. But something unexpected happened 2 days later. My phone rang again, this time with a familiar number. "Sarah, it's Isabel." My sister's voice came through the international connection with surprising clarity. It had been months since we'd spoken directly. "Isabel, how are things in Germany?" "They're good. Listen, I heard from Mom that you invited the family to visit your facility. I wanted you to know that I'm actually interested." I was stunned. Isabel was the last person I expected to show interest in my work. "Really? Why?" "Sarah, I've been thinking a lot about what happened at Miguel's baptism. The way the family talked about your work, the way we all dismissed what you're doing, it didn't sit right with me." She went on to explain that she'd been dealing with some of her own challenges in Germany. Several pilots in her squadron had been grounded due to various injuries and mental health issues related to their deployments. The standard approach was medical evaluation, followed by either limited duty or medical discharge. But I kept thinking about what you said that night, about helping people reclaim their capabilities instead of managing their limitations. I started wondering if there might be different approaches that could help some of these pilots return to flight status. Isabel told me she had 2 weeks of leave coming up and wanted to spend them learning about rehabilitation methods that might be applicable to grounded pilots. She was particularly interested in treating PTSD and anxiety disorders that were affecting pilots' ability to fly. Sarah, I want to see what you're actually doing. I want to understand why you chose this path. And honestly, I want to apologize for not taking you seriously before. This was not the conversation I had expected to have with my sister. Isabel had always been the most distant of my siblings, focused entirely on her own career and achievements. The fact that she was not only interested in my work, but willing to use her leave time to learn about it, was completely unprecedented. Of course you can visit. I'd love to show you what we do here. But Isabel, why the change of heart? Because I realized that what you're describing, helping people rediscover their capabilities, that's exactly what I need for my squadron. And if you've figured out how to do that, I want to learn from you. We spent the next hour planning her visit. Isabel would arrive in 10 days and spend a full week observing our programs, participating in training sessions, and learning about our methodologies. She was particularly interested in cognitive rehabilitation techniques and stress management protocols. But the biggest surprise came at the end of our conversation. Sarah, there's something else. I talked to Carlos after Mom mentioned your invitation. He's interested too. Carlos wants to visit? He does. He said he's been watching some of his SEAL teammates struggle with injuries and PTSD, and the standard military approach isn't working for everyone. He wants to see if there are better ways to help special operations personnel recover from combat injuries. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. Carlos, the Navy SEAL who had dismissed my patients as broken for good, was now interested in learning about rehabilitation techniques for his own teammates. But Sarah, Isabel continued, he's hesitant to admit he was wrong about your work. You know how Carlos is about admitting mistakes. He's going to need some convincing that this visit is worth his time. What kind of convincing? Results. He needs to see concrete examples of people who have achieved what he would consider impossible recoveries, especially special operations personnel or elite combat troops who have returned to full duty after injuries that would normally end their careers. This was exactly the kind of challenge I lived for. I knew I had the cases to impress Carlos, but I also knew I'd only get one chance to change his mind. Tell Carlos he can visit anytime he wants, and tell him to bring his skepticism. I'll show him things that will challenge everything he thinks he knows about human limitations. After I hung up with Isabel, I sat in my office reviewing the files of our most impressive success stories. If I was going to convince my family that my work was valuable, I needed to curate the perfect examples. But as I was reviewing cases, my phone rang again. This time it was Major Williams, my supervisor. Rodriguez, I just got off the phone with the Pentagon. They want to send a delegation here to evaluate our programs for potential expansion throughout the military medical system. That's incredible news, ma'am. It gets better. They specifically requested that you lead the presentation to the delegation. They want to see our Marine rehabilitation program in action, and they want you to explain our methodologies. Major Williams went on to explain that the delegation would include high-ranking medical officers from all branches of the military, as well as officials from the Department of Veterans Affairs and representatives from Congress who oversee military medical funding. This is a career-defining opportunity, Rodriguez. If this presentation goes well, you could be looking at a promotion, expanded funding for our programs, and the chance to influence military rehabilitation protocols worldwide. The presentation was scheduled for 3 weeks away, exactly 1 week after Isabel and Carlos were planning to visit. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. Ma'am, I have a request. My sister and brother are planning to visit during that time. One is an Air Force pilot, the other is a Navy SEAL. They're both interested in learning about our rehabilitation approaches for their respective units. Would it be possible for them to observe the delegation presentation? Major Williams considered this for a moment. Actually, that might work well. Having active duty personnel from other branches observe the presentation could provide valuable perspective. And if they're asking intelligent questions, it might demonstrate the broader applicability of our methods. This was shaping up to be the perfect storm. I would have the chance to prove my worth to my family and to the military establishment simultaneously. But it also meant the pressure was enormous. I had one chance to demonstrate that everything I'd been working toward was legitimate, valuable, and worthy of respect. Over the next week, I threw myself into preparation with an intensity I'd never experienced before. I reviewed every case file, practiced every presentation, and coordinated with our most successful former patients to see if they'd be willing to participate in the demonstration. The response from our alumni was overwhelming. Marcus sent word from Afghanistan that he wished he could be there to speak on behalf of the program. Maria Santos, who is now running drum therapy programs at 3 different VA hospitals, cleared her schedule to participate. Jennifer Liu, the double amputee who'd returned to cybersecurity, volunteered to demonstrate her current physical capabilities. Robert Kim, the burn victim who'd returned to explosive ordnance disposal, offered to explain how our cognitive rehabilitation techniques had helped him overcome the psychological barriers to handling explosives again. But the biggest surprise came from Staff Sergeant Michael Chen, not the David Chen I'd met during my college volunteer work, but a different Chen who had become one of our most remarkable success stories. Michael had sustained a traumatic brain injury, severe burns, and the loss of his left arm in a vehicle-borne IED explosion in Iraq. When he arrived at our center 18 months ago, he was nonverbal, confined to a wheelchair, and suffering from severe PTSD that manifested as violent outbursts whenever he heard loud noises. The traditional medical approach had been to manage his symptoms and prepare his family for the likelihood that he would require full-time care indefinitely. Multiple specialists had concluded that his combination of injuries was too severe for significant recovery. But Michael had made progress that defied every medical prediction. Through a combination of cognitive rehabilitation, adaptive technology training, and carefully structured exposure therapy, he had not only regained his speech and mobility, but had developed new skills that made him more capable in some areas than he had been before his injuries. The most remarkable part of Michael's recovery was that he had become a programmer and cybersecurity specialist. His brain injury had actually enhanced certain cognitive abilities related to pattern recognition and logical analysis. His prosthetic arm had been fitted with specialized interfaces that allowed him to type faster and more accurately than most people with biological hands. "Lieutenant Rodriguez," Michael said when he called to volunteer for the presentation, "I want to be there because I need people to understand something. I'm not the same person I was before I got hurt. I'm better. I'm more capable, more focused, more purposeful than I ever was before. And that's because someone saw potential instead of limitations." Michael's case was exactly the kind of example that would challenge Carlos's assumptions about recovery limitations. But more than that, it was proof that our approach wasn't just about helping people return to their previous capabilities. It was about helping them discover capabilities they never knew they had. As the week progressed, I found myself working 18-hour days to prepare for what felt like the most important presentation of my career. But I also found myself dealing with unexpected anxiety about my family's visit. What if they weren't impressed? What if they found ways to diminish what we'd accomplished? What if they attended the Pentagon presentation and still concluded that my work was somehow less valuable than real medicine? These fears came to a head 3 days before Isabel and Carlos were scheduled to arrive. I was in my office late one evening, reviewing presentation notes, when my phone rang. It was my father. "Sarah, I wanted to call you before your siblings visit." "What's on your mind, Dad?" "I want you to know that your mother and I appreciate the invitation you extended to the family. Even though we can't make it ourselves, we're glad that Isabel and Carlos are taking the time to see what you're doing." There was something in his tone that I couldn't quite identify. It wasn't the usual dismissive attitude I'd become accustomed to. "But I also want to manage your expectations," he continued. "Your siblings are coming to learn about techniques that might help their units. They're not coming to validate your career choices. Don't put too much pressure on this visit to change how the family sees your work." "Dad, why can't you ever just support what I'm doing without qualification?" "Sarah, it's not that we don't support you. We just want to make sure you're realistic about the scope and impact of your work. Physical therapy is important, but it's a narrow specialty. You have the capability to do work that could affect thousands of lives instead of dozens. Quote, "This was the same conversation we'd been having for 3 years, just with slightly different words. But this time, instead of getting frustrated, I felt a strange sense of calm. Dad, what if I told you that the work I'm doing here is about to influence military rehabilitation protocols worldwide? What if I told you that the Pentagon is sending a delegation here specifically to evaluate our programs for potential expansion throughout the entire military medical system?" There was a long pause. "Is that true?" "It's happening next week, during Isabel and Carlos's visit." Another pause, longer this time. "Sarah, why didn't you mention this before?" "Because I wanted to prove that my work was valuable before I told you about the recognition it was receiving. I wanted you to see the results, not just the accolades." For the first time in years, my father sounded genuinely interested in what I was doing. "Tell me more about this Pentagon delegation." I spent the next 30 minutes explaining the upcoming presentation, the cases we'd be demonstrating, and the potential implications for military medicine. My father asked detailed questions about our methodologies, our success rates, and our plans for expansion. "Sarah," he said finally, "this sounds significant. More significant than I realized." "Dad, this is what I've been trying to tell you for 3 years. The work we do here isn't just physical therapy. We're pioneering new approaches to human potential and recovery that challenge fundamental assumptions about what's possible after severe injury." "I'm beginning to understand that. And Sarah?" "Yes?" "I'm proud of you for sticking with your convictions, even when we didn't support them." It was the first time in 3 years that my father had expressed pride in my work without qualification or reservation. But more than that, I could hear in his voice that he was finally beginning to understand that what I'd been trying to tell them all along was true. I wasn't wasting my potential. I was fulfilling it in ways they hadn't been able to see. The conversation with my father gave me a new sense of confidence about the upcoming visits, but it also increased the pressure I felt to deliver a presentation that would prove, once and for all, that the work my family had dismissed as playing doctor was actually changing the landscape of military medicine. 2 days later, Isabel arrived at Fort Carson. I picked her up at the Colorado Springs airport, and the drive back to base was the longest conversation we'd had in years. "Sarah, I need to tell you something," she said as we drove through the mountains. "I've been doing some research about traumatic brain injuries and PTSD in military personnel. The statistics are sobering." She went on to explain that she'd been reviewing data about grounded pilots, medical retirements, and suicide rates among military personnel with combat-related injuries. The numbers were far worse than I had realized. "What I'm seeing in my squadron isn't unusual. It's systemic. We're losing good people not because their injuries are untreatable, but because the current treatment approaches aren't working." Isabel told me about Captain James Morrison, one of the best pilots in her squadron, who had been grounded after developing severe anxiety following a near crash during a training exercise. The standard treatment had been medication and counseling, but after 6 months, he still couldn't get back in a cockpit without panic attacks. "Sarah, if what you're doing here could help someone like Captain Morrison return to flight status, it could revolutionize how we handle psychological injuries in the Air Force." This was exactly the kind of case our program was designed for. We had developed specific protocols for treating performance anxiety and PTSD in high-stress occupations. But hearing Isabel describe it in terms of its potential impact on Air Force operations made me realize that our work had applications I hadn't fully considered. "Isabel, I think you're going to be very interested in what we show you this week." When we arrived at the Warrior Recovery Center, Isabel's first reaction was surprise at the facility itself. Like most people who hadn't seen our operation before, she had expected something that looked like a traditional hospital or therapy center. "This looks more like a training facility than a medical center," she said, looking around at the rock climbing walls, the prosthetic obstacle courses, and the virtual reality systems. "That's intentional," I explained. "We don't want our patients to feel like they're in a medical environment. We want them to feel like they're in a place where they can push their limits and discover what they're capable of." I introduced Isabel to Major Williams, who gave her a comprehensive overview of our philosophy and methodologies. But the real impact came when she met our current patients. The first person I introduced her to was Staff Sergeant David Park, a Marine helicopter pilot who had sustained a traumatic brain injury in a crash landing. When David arrived at our center 3 months earlier, he had been experiencing severe spatial disorientation, memory problems, and panic attacks that made it impossible for him to fly. "Captain Martinez," David said when I introduced them, "Lieutenant Rodriguez has been helping me understand that my brain injury doesn't have to end my flying career. It just means I need to develop new strategies for processing spatial information." David went on to explain how our cognitive rehabilitation program had helped him compensate for his injury-related deficits by strengthening other cognitive abilities. He was now flying again, not just in simulators but in actual aircraft. Isabel was fascinated. "Staff Sergeant Park, how long were you grounded before you came here?" 8 months, ma'am. 3 different medical boards had recommended permanent grounding. They said my spatial processing deficits made it too dangerous for me to pilot aircraft. "And now?" "Ma'am, I passed my flight physical last week. I'm returning to full flight status next month." I watched Isabel's expression as David described his recovery. This was exactly the kind of case she had been hoping to learn about. A pilot who had been written off by the medical system, but who had returned to flight status through innovative rehabilitation approaches. Over the next 3 days, Isabel observed our programs, participated in training sessions, and interviewed dozens of our current and former patients. But the moment that really changed her perspective came on her 3rd day, when she witnessed one of our virtual reality PTSD treatment sessions. The patient was Captain Lisa Chen, an Army helicopter pilot who had developed severe PTSD after being shot down in Afghanistan. Lisa had been experiencing panic attacks, hypervigilance, and intrusive memories that made it impossible for her to fly or even be around aircraft. Using our VR system, Lisa was gradually re-exposed to flying environments in a controlled, safe setting. She could practice managing her anxiety responses while experiencing realistic flight scenarios, but with the ability to pause, discuss, and process her reactions in real time with her therapist. "This is incredible," Isabel whispered as we observed the session. "She's actually flying again, even if it's virtual." "The goal is to help her transfer these coping skills to real flight situations," I explained. "We've had a 78% success rate in returning pilots with PTSD to active flight status using this approach." Isabel was quiet for a long moment, watching Lisa navigate a challenging landing scenario in the VR environment. "Sarah, this could change everything for the Air Force. Do you realize how many pilots we lose to PTSD every year?" That evening, Isabel and I had dinner at a restaurant near the base. It was the first time in years that we had spent time together just as sisters, without the rest of the family present. "Sarah, I owe you an apology," she said over dinner. "I completely misunderstood what you were doing here. This isn't just physical therapy. This is pioneering work in human performance and recovery. Thank you for being willing to see it with fresh eyes. But I also need to understand something. Why didn't you ever explain it this way to the family? Why didn't you tell us about the scope and impact of what you were doing?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself for months. Because every time I tried to explain it, you all focused on what it wasn't rather than what it was. When I said physical therapy, you heard not surgery. When I said rehabilitation, you heard not real medicine. I stopped trying to convince you because it felt like you had already made up your minds. Isabel nodded slowly. "You're right, we did make up our minds. And we were wrong." She went on to tell me that she had already started making notes about how our approaches could be adapted for Air Force use. She was particularly interested in our cognitive rehabilitation techniques and our VR-based exposure therapy protocols. "Sarah, when I get back to Germany, I'm going to propose a pilot program based on what I've learned here. I think we can help a lot of grounded pilots return to flight status." This was more than I had dared to hope for. Isabel wasn't just accepting my work, she was planning to implement it in her own unit. "But there's something else," she continued. "I've been texting with Carlos throughout my visit. I've been sending him updates about what I'm seeing here. He's impressed." "Really? Really? In fact, he's arriving tomorrow, instead of next week. He wants to see as much as possible before the Pentagon presentation." I was nervous about Carlos's visit. Isabel had been skeptical but open-minded. Carlos would be actively looking for flaws, limitations, and reasons to dismiss what we were doing. But after seeing Isabel's transformation over just 3 days, I felt more confident that our work could speak for itself. Carlos arrived the next afternoon, and his presence immediately changed the energy in the facility. Navy SEALs have a reputation for intensity, and Carlos lived up to it. He approached every demonstration, every case study, every conversation with the analytical precision of someone who is used to making life-or-death decisions based on incomplete information. "Sarah," he said after his initial tour of the facility, "show me your hardest cases. I want to see your failures as well as your successes. I want to understand the real limitations of what you're doing here." This was exactly the challenge I had expected from Carlos, but it was also exactly the right approach. Our work was powerful precisely because we didn't oversell it or claim unrealistic success rates. "Carlos, I'm going to introduce you to someone who represents both our greatest success and our most sobering limitation." I took him to meet Staff Sergeant Michael Chen, the Marine I had mentioned earlier, who had sustained a traumatic brain injury, severe burns, and the loss of his left arm. Michael was in our computer lab, working on a cybersecurity project that had been commissioned by the Department of Defense. "Staff Sergeant Chen," I said, "I'd like you to meet my brother, Senior Chief Petty Officer Carlos Martinez. He's here to learn about our rehabilitation approaches for special operations personnel." Michael looked up from his computer and extended his prosthetic hand to Carlos. "Senior Chief, it's an honor to meet you. I've heard about the work you guys do downrange." Carlos shook Michael's prosthetic hand, and I could see him evaluating everything. Michael's demeanor, his obvious cognitive sharpness, his confident body language. "Staff Sergeant, Lieutenant Rodriguez tells me you've made some remarkable progress here. Can you tell me about your injuries and your recovery?" Michael spent the next hour describing his injuries, his initial prognosis, and his recovery process. But more importantly, he demonstrated his current capabilities. He showed Carlos the cybersecurity program he was developing, explained the advanced prosthetic interfaces he was using, and discussed the cognitive rehabilitation techniques that had helped him overcome his brain injury. "Senior Chief," Michael said, "I need you to understand something. I'm not the same person I was before I got hurt. I'm better. My brain injury actually enhanced certain cognitive abilities related to pattern recognition and logical analysis. My prosthetic arm gives me capabilities that biological hands don't have. I'm not a recovered victim. I'm an improved warrior." Carlos was clearly impressed, but I could see him processing the implications. "Staff Sergeant, what percentage of patients achieve this level of recovery?" This was the question I had been expecting, and it was the right question to ask. "Senior Chief," Michael replied, "that's not the right way to think about it. The question isn't what percentage of patients achieve my specific level of recovery. The question is what percentage of patients achieve their optimal potential, given their specific circumstances and goals." Michael went on to explain that recovery wasn't a standardized outcome, but a personalized process. Some patients returned to their previous capabilities. Others, like himself, discovered new capabilities. Still others found different but equally valuable ways to contribute. "The program's success isn't measured by how many people become exactly like me," Michael said. "It's measured by how many people find their own path to meaningful contribution and personal fulfillment." Carlos spent the rest of the day observing our programs and interviewing patients. But the conversation that really changed his perspective happened that evening, when he met Staff Sergeant Tony Rodriguez, no relation, a former Navy SEAL who had sustained multiple injuries in an IED explosion. Tony had lost his right leg below the knee, sustained a traumatic brain injury, and developed severe PTSD. When he arrived at our center 6 months earlier, he was convinced his military career was over and was struggling with depression and substance abuse. "Senior Chief," Tony said when I introduced them, "I know what you're thinking. You're thinking I'm finished as an operator. That's what I thought too." Carlos listened as Tony described his recovery process. But more than that, he listened as Tony described his current role. "I'm not going back to SEAL teams," Tony said, "but I'm not leaving the teams either. I'm developing new training protocols for SEAL candidates based on what I learned about mental resilience during my recovery. I'm also working with active teams on PTSD prevention and cognitive performance optimization." Tony explained that his injuries had given him insights into mental toughness and resilience that he never would have developed otherwise. He was now considered an expert in combat psychology and was consulted by SEAL commands worldwide. Senior Chief, I lost my leg and part of my cognitive function, but I gained something more valuable: a deep understanding of how the human mind responds to extreme stress and how to train people to be more resilient. Carlos was quiet for a long moment after Tony finished speaking. Finally, he said, "Tony, you're describing capabilities that could revolutionize special operations training." "That's exactly what's happening, Senior Chief. The Navy is implementing training protocols based on my work at multiple SEAL training facilities." That evening, Carlos, Isabel, and I had dinner together. It was the first time the three of us had spent time alone together in years. "Sarah," Carlos said, "I came here expecting to find feel-good stories about people adapting to limitations. Instead, I found people who have transcended their previous limitations and are contributing at levels they never achieved before their injuries." "That's what we've been trying to tell you," Isabel added. "Sarah isn't running a traditional rehabilitation program. She's running a human performance optimization program that uses injury as a catalyst for growth." Carlos nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about this all day. In special operations, we talk a lot about overcoming adversity and finding strength through challenges. But we've never systematically applied those principles to injury recovery." He went on to explain that he was already thinking about how our approaches could be applied to special operations personnel who were typically written off after certain types of injuries. "Sarah, I want to bring some of my teammates here for evaluation. We have guys who are being medically retired for injuries that I now think might be recoverable using your methods." This was beyond anything I had hoped for. Both Isabel and Carlos weren't just accepting my work, they were planning to implement it in their own units. But the real test was still to come. The Pentagon delegation was arriving in 2 days, and their evaluation would determine whether our approaches would be expanded throughout the military medical system. "Sarah," Isabel said as we finished dinner, "are you ready for the presentation?" "I think so. But having you both here, seeing that you finally understand what we're doing, that matters more to me than any Pentagon evaluation." Carlos reached across the table and put his hand on mine. "Sarah, I owe you an apology. I completely misjudged your work and your commitment. You're not wasting your potential. You're fulfilling it in ways that are going to change military medicine." For the first time in 3 years, I felt like my family was finally beginning to see me for who I had become rather than who they thought I should be. But I had no idea that the real surprise was still to come. Because the next morning, I received a call that would change everything about the upcoming Pentagon presentation and about my relationship with my family forever. Part 3, The Honor Guard. Final part. The call that changed everything came at 7:15 a.m. the morning before the Pentagon presentation. I was in my office reviewing my notes one final time when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number with a Washington, D.C. area code that I didn't recognize. "Lieutenant Rodriguez, this is General Patricia Morrison, Surgeon General of the Army." I nearly dropped my phone. The Surgeon General was calling me directly? "Ma'am, this is Lieutenant Rodriguez. How can I help you?" "Lieutenant, I'm calling about tomorrow's presentation to the Pentagon delegation. I've been reviewing the preliminary reports about your work at the Warrior Recovery Center, and I need to discuss something with you urgently." My heart began racing. Had something gone wrong? Was the presentation being canceled? "What can I tell you, General?" "Lieutenant Rodriguez, what I'm about to share with you is classified, but it directly impacts tomorrow's presentation. 3 days ago, we received intelligence about a planned terrorist attack on a military medical facility. The attack was prevented by a team of Marines who had been written off by the medical establishment as permanently disabled." General Morrison went on to explain that a group of Marines, all former patients of various rehabilitation programs, had been working together as civilian contractors providing security for military installations. When intelligence indicated an imminent attack on Walter Reed Medical Center, this team had volunteered to supplement the regular security forces. Lieutenant Rodriguez, the leader of this security team, was Staff Sergeant Marcus Thompson. My breath caught. Marcus had completed his deployment and was back in the States? "Ma'am, Marcus Thompson was one of my patients here at Fort Carson." "I know. And according to the after-action reports, His performance during this operation was extraordinary. He led a team of 8 other wounded warriors in preventing what could have been a catastrophic attack on one of our most important medical facilities. General Morrison explained that Marcus and his team had identified and neutralized 3 separate terrorist cells that had planned to simultaneously attack the hospital with explosives and automatic weapons. The operation had required the kind of tactical precision and physical capability that most people would consider impossible for individuals with severe combat injuries. But here's what makes this particularly relevant to tomorrow's presentation, General Morrison continued. Every single member of Marcus's team was a graduate of rehabilitation programs that use methodologies similar to yours. And Marcus specifically requested that I contact you. He requested that you contact me? Lieutenant Rodriguez, Staff Sergeant Thompson told me that everything he accomplished in preventing this attack was made possible by the rehabilitation program you developed. He said that without your approach to recovery, none of these Marines would have been capable of this level of performance. General Morrison went on to explain that Marcus's team hadn't just prevented the attack, they had done so with a level of tactical excellence that impressed even the most elite military units. Their combination of combat experience, advanced prosthetics, and the mental resilience they had developed during rehabilitation had made them uniquely effective. Lieutenant Rodriguez, I want you to understand the significance of what I'm telling you. 9 Marines who had been written off by the military medical establishment just prevented one of the most serious terrorist threats we've faced on domestic soil. And they did it because someone taught them to see their injuries as capabilities rather than limitations. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just about individual recovery stories anymore. This was about national security and the strategic value of rehabilitation programs that could return injured warriors to not just active duty, but to elite performance levels. Ma'am, what does this mean for tomorrow's presentation? It means that tomorrow's presentation just became the most important briefing on military medicine in the past decade. The Secretary of Defense will be attending personally, along with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They want to understand how we can scale your approach across the entire military medical system. General Morrison explained that the Pentagon delegation had been expanded to include not just medical officers, but also intelligence officials, special operations commanders, and congressional representatives who oversee national security funding. Lieutenant Rodriguez, you're not just presenting a rehabilitation program tomorrow. You're presenting a new paradigm for how we think about human capability and national defense. Quote, after I hung up with General Morrison, I sat in my office trying to process what I had just learned. Marcus and 8 other Marines I had helped rehabilitate had just prevented a major terrorist attack. The work that my family had dismissed as playing doctor had directly contributed to protecting national security. But more than that, I realized that everything I had been working toward was about to be validated at the highest levels of government and military leadership. I called Isabel and Carlos immediately to update them about the expanded presentation. Both were amazed by the news about Marcus's operation and the implications for tomorrow's briefing. Sarah, Carlos said, do you realize what this means? You're not just going to be presenting to medical officers anymore. You're going to be briefing the people who make strategic decisions about military capability and national defense. Isabel was equally impressed. Sarah, this validates everything you've been saying about the strategic value of rehabilitation. You're going to be showing them that injured warriors aren't just patients to be managed. They're assets to be optimized. That afternoon, I received another unexpected call. This time, it was from Staff Sergeant Marcus Thompson himself. Ma'am, I heard that General Morrison contacted you about our operation. Marcus, I can't believe what you and your team accomplished. Are you okay? Is everyone safe? We're all fine, ma'am. Better than fine. But I'm calling because I want you to know something. Everything we did this week was possible because of what you taught us about capability versus limitation. Marcus went on to explain that his team's effectiveness hadn't just been about their individual physical capabilities. It had been about their mental approach to challenges, their ability to see solutions instead of obstacles, and their understanding that their injuries had actually enhanced certain abilities rather than just limiting others. Ma'am, my prosthetic leg gave me stability and leverage that helped me maintain position during the firefight. Rodriguez's prosthetic arm allowed him to operate equipment in ways that would have been impossible with a biological hand. Chen's brain injury had enhanced his pattern recognition abilities, which helped him identify the terrorist surveillance patterns. This was exactly what I had been trying to explain to my family for 3 years. These Marines hadn't overcome their injuries. They had integrated them into enhanced capabilities. Marcus, I'm presenting our program to a Pentagon delegation tomorrow. Your operation is going to be a major part of the discussion. Ma'am, that's actually why I'm calling. My team and I would like to be there for your presentation. I was stunned. You want to attend the presentation? Ma'am, we want to do more than attend. We want to participate. We want to demonstrate what's possible when you give wounded warriors the right training and the right mindset. Marcus explained that his team had already been in contact with the Pentagon and had been cleared to participate in the presentation. They would arrive that evening and would be available to answer questions, demonstrate capabilities, and provide testimony about the effectiveness of our rehabilitation approaches. But ma'am, there's something else. We've been in contact with other graduates of your program and word has spread about tomorrow's presentation. A lot of Marines want to show their support. What do you mean? Ma'am, 12 Marines who graduated from your program are coming to Fort Carson tomorrow. We want to form an honor guard for your presentation. We want to make sure that everyone in that room understands the respect and gratitude that the Marine Corps has for your work. I was speechless. 12 Marines were coming to form an honor guard for my presentation? This was beyond anything I could have imagined. Marcus, that's incredible. But you don't need to do that. Ma'am, with respect, yes we do. You gave us our lives back, you gave us our purpose back, you proved that we weren't broken. The least we can do is stand with you when you're presenting that same opportunity to other wounded warriors. That evening, Marcus and 8 other Marines arrived at Fort Carson. I met them at the base entrance, and seeing them together was overwhelming. These were Marines who had been written off by the medical establishment, who had been told they would never serve effectively again, who had been classified as permanently disabled. But standing before me were 9 warriors who had just prevented a major terrorist attack. They looked like a special operations unit, confident, capable, and ready for anything. Ma'am, Marcus said as they approached, I'd like you to meet the team. Quote. He introduced me to each Marine, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, the double amputee I had mentioned earlier, Sergeant Chen, the TBI patient with enhanced pattern recognition, Corporal Liu, the burn victim who had returned to cybersecurity, Staff Sergeant Park, the pilot who had overcome spatial processing deficits, and 4 others whose stories were equally remarkable. Gentlemen, I said, I can't tell you how proud I am of what you accomplished this week. You've proven everything we've been working toward. Ma'am, said Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, we proved what you taught us, that our injuries don't define our limitations, our mindset does. That evening, Isabel, Carlos, and I had dinner with Marcus's team. The conversation was unlike anything I had ever experienced. These Marines discussed tactics, technology, and strategic thinking, with a sophistication that impressed even Carlos, who was accustomed to working with elite operators. What you guys did this week, Carlos said to the group, required the kind of tactical excellence that most special operations units would struggle to achieve. How did you coordinate so effectively as a team? Sergeant Chen answered, Senior Chief, our injuries forced us to develop communication and coordination skills that we never would have learned otherwise. When you can't rely on standard physical capabilities, you have to become more creative, more collaborative, and more precise in your planning. Staff Sergeant Park added, we also had to develop new ways of thinking about capability and limitation. When you realize that a prosthetic limb can be an advantage rather than a disadvantage, it changes how you approach every tactical problem. Isabel was fascinated by their discussion of enhanced capabilities. You're describing injuries as force multipliers rather than force limiters. Exactly, Marcus replied. Lieutenant Rodriguez taught us to think about our injuries as modifications rather than losses. A prosthetic isn't a replacement for a missing limb. It's an upgrade to standard human capability. As I listened to this conversation, I realized that these Marines were articulating the philosophy I had been trying to explain to my family better than I ever could. They were living proof that the right approach to rehabilitation could create capabilities that exceeded normal human performance. The next morning was the day of the Pentagon presentation. I arrived at the Warrior Recovery Center early to find 12 Marines in full dress uniforms standing at attention outside the main entrance. They had formed a perfect honor guard, and the sight of them took my breath away. Marcus approached me as I got out of my car. "Ma'am, permission to escort you to your presentation?" I was so overwhelmed I could barely speak. "Marcus, I don't know what to say." "Ma'am, you don't need to say anything. Just do what you've always done. Show them what's possible." The 12 Marines formed up around me and escorted me into the building. Isabel and Carlos followed, both clearly moved by the display of respect and gratitude these Marines were showing. Inside the main conference room, the Pentagon delegation was already assembled, but this wasn't the small group of medical officers I had originally expected to address. The room was filled with high-ranking officials from every branch of the military, representatives from Congress, and officials from the Department of Veterans Affairs. At the head table sat General Morrison, the Secretary of Defense, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Major Williams introduced me to the delegation, but before I could begin my presentation, General Morrison stood up. "Ladies and gentlemen, before Lieutenant Rodriguez begins her presentation, I want to provide some context about why this briefing has become a matter of national security priority." General Morrison described the terrorist attack that had been prevented by Marcus's team, emphasizing that 9 Marines who had been classified as permanently disabled had just demonstrated tactical capabilities that exceeded those of most active-duty units. "The question before us today," General Morrison continued, "is how we scale Lieutenant Rodriguez's rehabilitation methodology across our entire military medical system. We're not just talking about helping wounded warriors adapt to civilian life. We're talking about creating enhanced military capabilities from personnel who have been written off by conventional medicine." The Secretary of Defense then stood up. "Lieutenant Rodriguez, I've reviewed the preliminary reports about your work, and I've been briefed on the recent operation conducted by your former patients. I want to understand how your approach differs from standard military rehabilitation, and what it would take to implement it system-wide." Quote, "This was the moment I had been preparing for my entire career. I stood up, looked around the room at the assembled officials, and began my presentation. Secretary Richardson, distinguished members of the delegation, I want to start by introducing you to the real experts on this subject." I gestured toward Marcus and his team, who were standing at the back of the room. These 9 Marines represent a fundamental shift in how we think about human capability and injury recovery. 3 years ago, each of them was told that their military career was over. Last week, they prevented one of the most serious terrorist attacks our nation has faced. I spent the next hour presenting our methodology, our success rates, and our vision for expanding the program. But more importantly, I let Marcus's team demonstrate their capabilities and explain their experiences. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez demonstrated his prosthetic interfaces, showing how they gave him capabilities that exceeded normal human performance in certain tasks. Sergeant Chen explained how his brain injury had enhanced his pattern recognition abilities, making him more effective at intelligence analysis than he had been before his injury. The delegation was clearly impressed, but the real breakthrough came when the chairman of the Joint Chiefs asked a question that went to the heart of everything we had been working toward. "Lieutenant Rodriguez, what you're describing sounds like you're not just rehabilitating injured personnel, you're creating enhanced warfighters. Is that an accurate assessment?" "Sir, that's exactly what we're doing. We're proving that the right approach to injury recovery can create capabilities that exceed pre-injury performance levels." The Secretary of Defense leaned forward. "Lieutenant Rodriguez, what would it take to implement this approach across all military medical facilities?" This was the question I had been hoping for. I outlined our requirements: expanded training for medical personnel, new equipment and facilities, and most importantly, a fundamental shift in how the military medical establishment thought about injury and recovery. "Sir, the biggest barrier isn't technical or financial, it's philosophical. We need to stop thinking about injured personnel as broken soldiers who need to be fixed. We need to start thinking about them as warriors who can be enhanced." Quote, "After my presentation, the delegation spent 2 hours questioning Marcus's team, observing demonstrations, and discussing implementation strategies. But the moment that really sealed the deal came when the Secretary of Defense asked Marcus a direct question. "Staff Sergeant Thompson, In your opinion, what would have happened if you and your team had been processed through standard military rehabilitation instead of Lieutenant Rodriguez's program? Marcus didn't hesitate. Sir, we would have been medically retired and classified as disabled veterans. We would be receiving benefits and adapting to civilian life. We never would have been capable of preventing last week's attack. The Secretary of Defense nodded slowly. And how many other potential attacks might we prevent if we had more teams like yours? Sir, that depends on how many wounded warriors we're willing to invest in instead of writing off. At the end of the day, the delegation announced their decision. Our rehabilitation program would be expanded to military medical facilities worldwide. I would be promoted to lieutenant colonel and given oversight of the new Enhanced Warrior Recovery Initiative. The program would receive a budget of $500 million over 5 years and would be implemented at 25 military medical centers. But more than the professional recognition, what mattered most to me was the conversation I had with Isabel and Carlos after the presentation. Sarah, Carlos said, I need to apologize to you, not just for misunderstanding your work, but for not supporting you when you needed it most. Isabel nodded. We all owe you an apology. You were pioneering work that's going to change military medicine forever, and we treated it like a hobby. You don't need to apologize, I said. You just needed to see it with your own eyes. But Carlos shook his head. No, Sarah, we should have trusted you. We should have known that someone with your intelligence and dedication wouldn't waste their time on something trivial. That evening, we called our parents to tell them about the day's events. My father answered the phone, and I could hear my mother in the background. Dad, I wanted to let you know how the Pentagon presentation went. I spent 20 minutes describing the expanded delegation, the Secretary of Defense's attendance, the program approval, and my promotion to lieutenant colonel. When I finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Sarah, my father finally said, I don't know what to say. I'm incredibly proud of you, and I'm ashamed that I didn't support you sooner. My mother took the phone. Mija, forgive us, we were so focused on traditional measures of success that we couldn't see the real value of what you were doing. Mom, Dad, you don't need to apologize, you just wanted what was best for me. But we were wrong about what was best for you, my father said. You knew what you were meant to do, and you did it despite our skepticism. That takes courage that I'm not sure I would have had. The next morning, something happened that I will never forget for the rest of my life. I woke up to the sound of vehicles outside my base housing. When I looked out the window, I saw 12 Marines in full dress uniform forming up in my front yard. Marcus knocked on my door. When I opened it, all 12 Marines came to attention and rendered a perfect salute. Ma'am, Marcus said, we wanted to personally thank you before we returned to our units. You didn't just help us recover from our injuries. You helped us discover who we were meant to become. One by one, each Marine stepped forward to shake my hand and express their gratitude. But it was what Staff Sergeant Rodriguez said that brought tears to my eyes. Ma'am, 3 years ago I thought my life was over. I thought I would spend the rest of my days as a burden on my family and society. Today I'm returning to active duty as an instructor at Marine Corps Schools of Infantry, where I'll be teaching other Marines about enhanced combat capabilities. You didn't just give me my life back, you gave me a purpose greater than anything I had before my injury. As the Marines formed up to leave, Marcus handed me a letter. Ma'am, this is from all of us. We wanted you to have something to remember this moment. I opened the letter that evening. It was signed by all 12 Marines, and it read, Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez. When we were injured, the world told us we were broken. When we arrived at your program, you told us we were enhanced. The difference between those two perspectives changed our lives, and, as of last week, may have changed our nation's history. We want you to know that every day we serve, every mission we complete, every life we save, we do in honor of the person who taught us that our scars are not signs of weakness, they are proof of strength. You didn't just heal our bodies. You healed our spirits and gave us a vision of ourselves that exceeded anything we had imagined before our injuries. We are proud to call you our leader, our teacher, and our friend. But most of all, we are proud to call you the person who proved that there are no lost causes, only lost opportunities to see potential. Semper Fi. Your Marines. 6 months later, I was featured on the cover of Military Medicine Journal as the officer who revolutionized injury recovery. The Enhanced Warrior Recovery Initiative had been implemented at 15 facilities and had already helped over 200 wounded warriors return to active duty in enhanced roles. Isabel had established a pilot program in Germany that had successfully returned 12 grounded pilots to flight status. Carlos had worked with SEAL Command to develop new training protocols that integrated injury recovery principles into special operations training. But more than any professional recognition, what mattered most was the phone call I received from my father on the 6-month anniversary of the Pentagon presentation. "Sarah, I've been thinking about what you accomplished, and I realized something. You didn't just prove that wounded warriors could be enhanced. You proved that anyone who believes in human potential can change the world." "Thank you, Dad. That means everything to me." "Sarah, I want you to know that your mother and I tell everyone we meet about your work. We tell them that our daughter is pioneering medicine that's changing how the world thinks about human capability. For 3 years, I had wanted nothing more than my family's respect and understanding. But what I had discovered was something more valuable. The knowledge that the work I was doing mattered more than their approval. The people my family had called lost causes had become my greatest advocates. The work they had dismissed as pointless had prevented a terrorist attack and changed military medicine forever. The career they had said was a waste of my potential had given me a purpose that exceeded anything I could have imagined. Today, the Enhanced Warrior Recovery Initiative operates at 35 military medical facilities worldwide. We've helped over 800 wounded warriors return to active duty in enhanced roles. Marcus Thompson was recently promoted to gunnery sergeant and is leading a new Marine Corps unit that specializes in tactical operations requiring enhanced human capabilities. But the statistic I'm most proud of is this. We have a 0% suicide rate among program graduates. When people discover that their injuries are enhancements rather than limitations, they don't just want to live, they want to serve, to contribute, to make a difference. The work my family once mocked as playing doctor has become a new field of medicine called enhancement rehabilitation. The Marines who formed an honor guard at my door have become living proof that the human spirit is more resilient than any injury. And sometimes, on quiet mornings at Fort Carson, I still think about that family dinner 3 years ago when they told me I was wasting my potential on broken soldiers who'd never be whole again. They were right about one thing. These soldiers would never be whole again. They became something better. They became enhanced. And so did I.